For over 10 years, back in the 90s, I worked with a senior pastor at the Presbyterian Church in Sewickley. I was there all 13 years that he was there. His name was David McFarland. And it was a joy to work with David. He was one of those people that was just so much fun to be with, but you never knew what he was going to do. So it was kind of a guessing game for 13 years about what will David do today? And what should I do as the assistant associate? He used to tease me that our church members could always tell which one of us was preaching by our sermon titles. David said that if the sermon title was straightforward and to the point, you knew that he was preaching. And that people could tell if I were preaching if the sermon, he said, if the sermon title was cute. He actually used that word. Now, in spite of that, today I'm dedicating my sermon title to my old boss, David. It even has a subtitle. Here it is. The World's Most Famous Detour, or Beat 'em Up, Pass 'em Up, Pick 'em Up, and Lift 'em Up. So get ready. This parable, of course, is Jesus is one of the most famous ones in the Bible, the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's a parable that has 100 subplots in it, doesn't it, Susan? You could preach every Sunday of the year and hit a different subplot in this parable. But today I want you to look with me at just one, the detours that the characters take, and there are 4 of them. The first detour is beat 'em up, the traveler, the victim in the parable. We don't know his name. We know he was a Jew. He was walking down this stretch of road that literally drops 3,300 feet in 17 miles. Today it's still called the Path of Blood. He was robbed. He was left for dead. This character never says anything in the story. He doesn't have any speech at all. Frankly, as I think about it, it was probably rather stupid of him to travel alone on that road. Most people then and even now travel in groups, in caravans, as they leave Jerusalem and go down to Jericho. This traveler was a victim, and maybe he had no one to blame but himself. We don't know that. Think of the times in your life when you felt beat up. Down in the ditch, looking up. Maybe you've been a loser in love, or a loser on the job, or a loser in friendship, a loser in skills that you needed to get by with. Granted, some of the times it's been somebody else's fault. A company goes down the tubes. Our kids inherited bad genes from somebody else, not us. But I must admit that there have been times in my life when I know it was my own fault that I was beat up. And we become victims at the mercy of some stranger, in this case, a Samaritan, who was thought of then as an enemy of the Jews. But for the injured traveler, the detour was a change. It was a change in wealth. He was robbed. It was a change in health. He was beat up. It meant trusting an enemy for help. It meant relying on someone else. All detours that most of us would not like to take if we're honest with ourselves. But often we must take those detours in our lives and let a stranger help us. The second detour is pass 'em up. The priest and the Levite in the story. 2 pillars of the Jewish faith, a priest and then a minor clergy called a Levite. We often have heard in the past that the priest was not allowed to touch an injured person if he were going down to do a service. But I read a new scholar who studied some more about this passage. She's a professor. Her name is Amy Jill Levine, and she disputes that. She says that the priest was directed to follow the Torah. The Torah says if you see someone injured, you stop, you help. If the victim has died, cover him up and go for help. The Levite, Professor Levi says, has not one religious excuse for not helping that injured Jew. Martin Luther King Jr., in one of his sermons, says he believes that these two, the priest and the Levite, were afraid. Like you said, they were afraid. They might have been thinking to themselves, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? Maybe the robbers are waiting for the next traveler to come. We better be on our way and not stop to help. Think of the times in your life when you've passed people up. This is a hard thing. Peer pressure against those who weren't quite in the in-group. So true, especially for teenagers. Telling white lies to cover up white-collar sins. Meaning to contact someone whom you knew needed your help, but you just didn't find the time to do it. Can you feel the frustration that beat-up traveler must have felt when he sensed there was another human being so near but refusing to help him, another human being passing by? For the priest and the Levite, the detour was a conflict of obligations, an opportunity to show compassion passed by them, a giving into fear instead of stopping to help. All detours that most of us would not like to take, but often we do in our own lives. We pass by. I know I have, and I grieve those times. The third detour is pick 'em up. Well, this is the Good Samaritan. You knew that. A half-breed Jew with mixed blood, therefore seen as unclean by really good Jews, couldn't use the same plates or utensils, believed in only part of the Jewish law, never spoken to by some of the real Jews, not a veteran of the whole system, so to speak. But this Samaritan, he stops. He acts. He pours on oil and wine. He bandages him. He puts the victim on his horse. He takes him to an inn. He gets him settled in there. He stops by to check on him the next day. He pays the tab. He leaves his business card so the innkeeper can bill him for any extra expenses. The Bible says he showed pity or compassion, a Greek word that's usually only used about Jesus. Martin Luther King says the Samaritan reverses the questions that the priest and Levite asked earlier. What will happen to me? Martin Luther King says the Samaritan asks himself, if I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? His love for a fallen stranger was genuine. The Samaritan is a perfect example of the three littles of love. I found these a while back, and they just have always intrigued me. He's an example of the little that love needs to know. He didn't ask any questions that we know of. The little that love needs to ask. The little that love needs to be ready to help. Think of the times in your life when you've lived out this pick 'em up compassion, as Terrell did for you. Right, Tim? You're not going to believe my story that was already written. Once I was following a car out Route 65 on the way from Ben Avon to Sewickley. When I realized the car, it was early morning, going to church, The car started very slowly veering off to the right, Author Road, toward the hill where Dixmont used to be. Well, I laid on my horn many, many times. The car jerked back onto the road, but then pulled over to stop. So I stopped too. A young woman got out of the car and started to cry. She had fallen asleep, having worked 2 shifts as a nurse at AGH, 2 shifts in a row. We talked for a minute, we hugged. I offered to drive her to Ambridge, where she lived. She said no, she was awake now for sure. I hope you've had times like that, when you've shown the kind of compassion that the Samaritan showed, especially to people who would least expect it of you, perhaps. Now, for the Samaritan, the detour meant this. It meant loss of time, loss of money, loss of transportation for a while. His horse was being used, loss of supplies, all detours that most of us wouldn't mind taking. But you know what? Sometimes it's just easier to do it, isn't it? Just easier not to stop. The 4th detour, one that I'm adding to the parable, is lift 'em up. This detour is made by none other than God. God took the greatest detour ever from heaven to earth in his Son, Jesus Christ. The Samaritan gave first aid. God gave what I call cross aid, dying on the cross for us. God comes to us in the ditches and the rocky roads of our lives, and he lifts us up with compassion, with a love that will not let us go. God's detour is forever. I don't think Jesus was satisfied with the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Jesus tells us in this parable that when we do unto others, we become what we do. The Samaritan became compassion. The Samaritan became Christ in this story. The fact is that we indeed are looking at this parable, I think, with the wrong questions and the wrong answers. Who is my neighbor? I think that's the wrong question. The people whom I know and I look like and I talk like and I think like, I think that's the wrong answer. The right question to me is, to whom should I be a neighbor? The right answer? Anyone in need. Anyone in need. It doesn't matter if I know them or look like them or talk like them or think like them. Anyone in need is the person to whom I should be a neighbor. And at the end of the story, Jesus says, go and do likewise. Go and do likewise. Those are the words for you and for me. So I'm begging of you, friends, don't be afraid of the detours. Thanks be to God.